I never planned to reveal who I really was, not to him, not to anyone. I loved simply, quietly. I dressed modestly, worked hard, never flashed the wealth I was born into. I wanted love to find me, not my last name. So when Mason, my husband at the time, looked me in the eyes one night and said, "I think we should divorce," I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just nodded. Because deep down, I already knew his late nights, the distance, the way he stopped looking at me like a partner and started treating me like an obstacle. I felt it. And then, of course, there was her, Diana. Young, loud, painted lips, and shallow confidence. She wasn't just a woman. She was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist, the president of Goldsmith Enterprises. And that apparently was Mason's idea of trading up. He left me believing he'd secured the jackpot love, lust, and limitless credit cards. What he didn't know, what he never cared enough to learn, was that Goldsmith Enterprises had been leasing their prestigious headquarters from one of my father's companies, and they were 4 months behind on rent. I didn't feel pain when he left. Not the kind people expect anyway. What I felt was stillness, like the silence right after a glass shatters, like standing in a room where everything looks familiar but nothing feels like home. He didn't pack much, just a few bags and a string of excuses. He barely looked back when he said, "You'll be better off." I think he actually believed that. Maybe it made him feel noble, as if leaving me for a younger, wealthier woman was some act of mercy. But I wasn't broken, not in the way he assumed. I had already begun the quiet process of letting go, long before the bags, long before the announcement, long before Diana. It started the day I found her name on his phone. A missed call, a message, a voice I wasn't supposed to hear saying things no colleague should say. My hands trembled, but my mind sharpened. That's the funny thing about betrayal. It doesn't always destroy you. Sometimes it carves clarity out of denial. I never confronted him that night. I didn't throw his phone or demand answers. I simply watched, listened, took notes. There's a calm kind of rage, not the screaming kind, but the cold, calculated sort. The kind that doesn't set fire to your life. It rewrites the ending. For weeks after that, I lived as his wife, cooked dinner, folded clothes, kissed him on the cheek when he left, all while gathering proof. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted freedom, clean, legal, irreversible freedom. The moment he brought up divorce, I didn't resist. Yes, I said, just one word, and it was enough. He seemed surprised by how quickly I agreed, almost offended, as if he expected me to beg. Maybe he wanted to feel powerful. Maybe he thought I'd fall apart without him. He had no idea that by the time he let go of me, I had already let go of him. Mason moved out the next day. I stayed behind in the house. We shared the one my father had quietly helped us purchase. Mason didn't know that either. He thought we had a mortgage. In reality, my father had cleared it the moment he sensed something was wrong. Quiet support like always, no lectures, just action. A week later, I returned to my family home. My parents embraced me without a single "I told you so." My father, a man who built an empire brick by brick, simply said, "Now we rebuild." I threw myself into work. Day after day, hour after hour. I stopped thinking about Mason. I stopped wondering how it all went wrong. I focused on projects, meetings, land acquisitions. I oversaw contracts and reorganized departments. I was no longer just the daughter of the CEO. I was preparing to be the CEO. One afternoon, exhausted and running on caffeine, I sat in my father's office. He looked up from his laptop and studied my face. "You need a break," he said. "I'm fine." "No, you're running. There's a difference." I hated how well he knew me, so I nodded. And just like that, I booked a solo trip, first to the Northeast for some quiet, then Los Angeles. It was in LA, in a lobby filled with polished marble and golden light, where the past came hurtling back with a smirk and a suitcase. "Mason?" I recognized his voice before I saw his face. Still loud, still self-satisfied. He was laughing at something dragging luggage behind him. and beside him, her, Diana. She looked like money. Not old money, not the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, but the kind that flaunts every inch of its privilege. Her heels clicked with purpose, her nails were blood red, and her eyes were scanning the room like it owed her something. She saw me first. "Hey, Mason," she said, tugging at his arm. "Isn't that your ex?" He turned, froze, then smiled. "Well, look who it is." I stood up, smoothed my dress, and greeted them like I was greeting old classmates at a high school reunion. "You're here alone?" Diana asked, tone dripping with false pity. "Yes," I replied, "just taking a break." Mason chuckled. "Still playing the modest card, huh?" I didn't flinch. "She's the daughter of Goldsmith Enterprises," he added proudly, nodding toward Diana like she was a business deal he'd landed. "Oh," I said, feigning surprise. "That name sounds familiar." It should. Diana jumped in. "We're kind of a big deal." I smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You know that skyscraper downtown?" Mason asked. "That's her dad's company's headquarters." I tilted my head. "Interesting. That building is one of ours." The silence between them was delicious. "What do you mean?" Yours, Diana, narrowed her eyes. "My father's company owns it. It's part of our real estate portfolio. Goldsmith Enterprises leases 3 floors. Though they've been late on rent recently." Mason's jaw twitched. Diana laughed too loudly. "You're joking." I took out my phone. "Would you like to see the rent notice?" I called my father right there in the lobby, calm, steady. "Hi, Dad. I'm with the daughter of Goldsmith Enterprises. Could you send me a copy of the payment notice?" Seconds later, a document landed in my inbox. I turned the screen toward them. 4 months overdue, amount due over 300,000. Mason blinked. Diana's smile froze. The heat in her face began to fade. "She's lying," Diana said, voice cracking. I shrugged. "Feel free to have your father call mine." Mason's mask fell. "You're doing this to humiliate me." "No," I said. "I'm doing this because I don't play pretend anymore." Then I dropped the final card. "Oh, and by the way, I'm 5 months pregnant." Their faces changed like seasons. With who Mason choked. "My husband. We married a few months ago. He's a senior partner in our company. It happened quickly, but when things are right, they don't need time to prove themselves." "But you said you couldn't have children," Mason stammered. "I said we hadn't succeeded. I never said I was the problem." And there it was. The crack in his confidence, the disbelief in Diana's eyes, the realization that he had left a future he couldn't comprehend for a fantasy he couldn't sustain. I didn't stay to watch them unravel. I simply turned, walked away, and let the silence follow me like a ghost they'd never shake. Back in my hotel room, I exhaled for the first time in hours. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. And that more than anything was the victory. The morning after our encounter in the hotel lobby, I woke up feeling lighter. Not happier, not victorious, just settled. There's a moment after enough time has passed when someone's absence no longer echoes, where their voice stops living in the corners of your mind. Mason had once filled so much of my world, not because he earned that space, but because I gave it freely, hoping love would be enough to build a life. But now, looking out at the sunrise over Los Angeles, I realized something simple but profound. I didn't miss him. I didn't miss his voice, or his hands, or the way he used to laugh in restaurants. What I missed, what I mourned, was the version of me who still believed he deserved me. That woman had been gentle, quiet, willing to shrink herself so he could feel tall. She had hidden her ambitions, swallowed her sadness, cooked late dinners to keep a man who had long stopped appreciating her. But she was gone now. The woman who remained was different, sharper, softer in the right ways, harder in the places that needed protection. Later that day, I returned home. My new home, one filled with light, not apologies. My husband greeted me with a kiss and a laugh. He wrapped his arms around my waist and asked if the trip gave me clarity. I said it gave me peace. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He just kissed my forehead and offered to make tea. That night, I told him everything, not out of bitterness, but as closure. He listened quietly without interruption. And when I finished, he didn't say, "You were too good for him," or "What a jerk." He said, "Thank you for surviving him." I wept in that moment. Not because I was sad, but because someone finally saw the woman behind the damage, not just the damage itself. From there, life didn't just move on, it bloomed. I stepped deeper into my role at the company. My father had begun speaking in quieter tones about retirement, a reality I'd once avoided, now something I stepped toward with purpose. I no longer worked from a place of obligation or inheritance. I worked with vision, with clarity. Every contract I reviewed, every negotiation I sat in on, every difficult call I made, I carried myself not as the daughter of the man who built the empire, but as the woman who would sustain it. And all the while, I grew new life inside me. 5 months and my body had changed. My priorities had too. I started speaking slower, sleeping better, choosing where I gave my energy more deliberately. I didn't need to prove myself, I just needed to be myself. And then the headlines started. It began as whispers in the corporate world. Something about Goldsmith Enterprises, rumors, then confirmations, investigations, an internal embezzlement scandal, millions misappropriated, clients defrauded. A senior executive, someone close to Diana's father, had been siphoning money for years. The discovery had been delayed because the company had tried to cover it up. But the truth, like rot, always rises to the surface eventually. TV stations picked it up next. Goldsmith collapse, executive theft rocks billion-dollar corporation, Goldsmith stock. Crashes amid embezzlement scandals. One article hit harder than the rest. It quoted anonymous employees, talked about mass layoffs, unpaid salaries, delayed pensions. Lawsuits were lining up like dominoes. The name Goldsmith no longer inspired confidence, it invited questions, and not the good kind. I never reached out to Diana or Mason. I didn't need to. But word has a way of finding you. One of my father's legal aides told me quietly that Mason had contacted the company through back channels, not to deny the rent delinquency that was now confirmed, but to ask for leniency. "We're going through a tough time," he had said. "Of course you are," I thought. That's what happens when you build your future on a fantasy, on the illusion of power, on connections you never earned. They were given a deadline: settle the debt or vacate the property. The law doesn't favor charm. Meanwhile, I stayed silent, not out of vengeance, but because that chapter of my life no longer held meaning. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of a man who adored me, who saw my strength and never once felt threatened by it, who held my hand in boardrooms and pressed his ear to my belly during quiet nights, listening for signs of our daughter's heartbeat. Yes, it was a girl. When the doctor announced it, my husband squeezed my hand and whispered, "She's going to change the world." I hope she does. But more than that, I hope she never forgets who she is to begin with. That was what I never had growing up, not permission to succeed. I always had that, but the belief that I could succeed without apology, that I didn't need to wear my softness like armor or dull my shine to protect someone else's ego. Now, with this child growing inside me, I was determined to do it differently. I would raise her to be bold, to love without fear, to lead without shame, to understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Sometimes I'd sit in the nursery we were building and imagine her walking through the world with the same quiet power my mother once carried. I'd think of how I'd teach her about heartbreak, not to avoid it, but to recognize when it's not her fault, to leave when she's unloved instead of waiting to be broken. One day when she's old enough, I'll tell her about Mason, not with bitterness, but with truth. I'll tell her I once loved a man who didn't know how to love me back, that I stayed too long because I confused loyalty with worth, that I gave up parts of myself thinking it would save us when in reality it was only drowning me. And then I'll tell her the most important part, that I left, that I rose, that I rebuilt, and that the life I have now, the one she was born into, wasn't handed to me. It was forged from loss, from pain, from betrayal, but also from courage, from clarity, from choosing myself over and over until it no longer felt like a battle. People still ask me sometimes if I regret marrying Mason, and to that I say no, because some lessons only come in the shape of people we wish we had never met. He taught me what I would no longer tolerate, what I deserved, who I had the potential to become when I stopped trying to fix what was never mine to fix. In the end, he gave me something priceless, the push I needed to become the woman I am now. And that was worth everything. Time passed as it always does, quietly, steadily, unbothered by who we are or what we've lost. The headlines faded. Goldsmith Enterprises never recovered. Their stocks tumbled, their reputation collapsed, and their tenants' hours included terminated contracts. My father never gloated. He simply made the necessary calls, signed the right papers, and moved forward. For him, business was business, clean, precise, without sentiment. But even he took a silent satisfaction in knowing that the daughter he raised no longer needed his protection. She had found her own power. We never did hear from Mason again. No phone call, no apology, no request to meet. That part didn't surprise me. People like him don't return to face what they ran from. They reinvent themselves elsewhere, find new stages to perform, on tell new lies to people who haven't yet learned who they really are. I often wondered what happened between him and Diana, whether their honeymoon glow dimmed under the weight of unpaid debts and corporate collapse, whether their laughter turned to blame, their affection into accusation, whether she saw through him or worse, became just like him. But I never dwelled on it long. That was no longer my story. My story was this: a woman who once gave everything to the wrong man and then gave everything to herself. And as the months passed, that story deepened. I gave birth in the spring, a quiet morning. Pale light coming through the hospital windows, my husband's hand wrapped around mine the entire time. He didn't pace the floor or panic. He just stayed close. He kept whispering, "You're doing incredible," over and over like a prayer. And when our daughter finally arrived, everything slowed. She was so small, so perfect. The nurse placed her on my chest, and I remember thinking I would go through every heartbreak again if it meant getting to this moment. We named her Aria, which means song or melody. And that's what she became in our lives: a soft, steady rhythm. A daily reminder that love doesn't always arrive where we expect it. Sometimes it comes after the storm. Sometimes it is the reason for the storm to wash away everything that couldn't withstand the truth. I took maternity leave for 3 months. I spent my mornings with her in the garden, her tiny fingers curled around mine, her breathing light and peaceful. Sometimes I'd hold her close and whisper all the things I wished someone had told me when I was young. You are enough. You don't need to be quiet to be loved. You don't have to fix people who refuse to fix themselves. When I returned to work, the office had changed. Not just because I'd been gone, but because I'd come back different. I no longer questioned my voice in boardrooms. I no longer downplayed my decisions. I led with the same tenderness I had always had, but now I let it be seen. My father watched me with quiet pride. One evening, after a particularly successful deal, he invited me to dinner, just the two of us. As we sat on the terrace of our favorite restaurant, he raised a glass to me and said, "I never imagined I'd retire early, but now I can." I smiled. "You're not leaving me, are you?" "No," he chuckled. "Just stepping back. Watching you lead is a gift. I only wish your mother were here to see it." We clinked glasses. The air smelled like jasmine and sea salt. Somewhere in the distance, laughter floated up from the street. I looked at him and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For never telling me I told you so. For never pushing me to leave Mason. For letting me discover my own strength." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The people we love don't need to be rescued. They need space to remember they were never powerless. That stayed with me. It became the foundation of how I chose to raise Arya. Not by shielding her from the world, but by teaching her to walk through it with a spine made of steel and a heart wide open. Some nights I'd hold her while she slept and think of all the versions of myself I had shed to become the woman she now called Mamo. The girl who stayed too long. The woman who said yes when she should have said no. The wife who thought love could cure contempt. The ex wife who walked away not in anger but in clarity. All those versions were necessary. They weren't failures, they were chapters. And now this was my new chapter. One without secrets, without shrinking, without silencing myself to keep the peace. And though I knew there would be more storms in life, more tests, more losses, I also knew this I would never again forget my worth to keep someone else comfortable. I used to think power came from being right. Now I know it comes from being real. Real with yourself, real about what you deserve, real about when to stay, and when to walk away with your head high and your soul intact. That's the story I carry now, not of a woman who was betrayed, but of a woman who returned to herself. And if there's anyone listening to this wondering whether you're strong enough to leave, to rebuild, to begin again, I want you to hear this. You don't need their apology. You don't need them to see your value. You don't need to be understood by those who benefit from your silence. What you need, what you've always needed, is to trust that your peace is not too expensive, that your joy is not negotiable, that your dignity is not a currency to trade for love. Because when you stop begging to be chosen, you begin to choose yourself. And that my love is when your real life begins.